The clock on the wall of death row doesn't tick like a normal clock. It doesn't feel like it's counting time. It feels like it's counting down something much more final. And on this particular Tuesday morning, with frost still clinging to the narrow window above cell block 9, that clock had less than 6 hours left to count. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious where you are watching from. Drop your country name in the comments section. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is his. Officer Marcus Webb, 14 years on the force, decorated 3 times for bravery. The kind of cop who ran toward the sound of gunfire when everyone else was running away. And now he sat on the edge of a thin mattress in a 6x8 cell, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed, breathing slowly, like a man who had made peace with something absolutely unbearable. The warden that morning had asked him, as they always do in those final hours, if he had a last request. Marcus didn't ask for a special meal. He didn't ask for a phone call. He asked for something that made the warden pause and look up from his clipboard for the first time all morning. He asked to see his dog. Not a family member, not a lawyer. His dog, a retired German shepherd named Atlas, who had been his partner for 7 years on the K9 unit. The request was unusual. It was actually unprecedented at that facility. But something about the quiet, unbroken dignity of the man sitting across from him made the warden pick up the phone and make a call he never expected to make on a Tuesday morning. And what happened over the next 4 hours would shake the foundations of everything everyone in that prison thought they knew about justice, about loyalty, and about the extraordinary truth that sometimes only an animal can see. But to understand what Atlas did that morning, you have to understand who Marcus Webb was before those prison walls swallowed him up. Marcus grew up in a mid-sized city in the American Midwest, the son of a bus driver and a school librarian. He wasn't supposed to become a cop. He'd actually started studying to become a veterinarian, if you can believe that, which tells you everything you need to know about how his story with Atlas was always somehow written in the stars. But midway through his second year of college, his neighborhood took a turn. A series of violent crimes hit close to home. A friend's younger brother was killed in a robbery gone wrong. Marcus came home for the funeral, saw the look on his mother's face when she walked past that corner every single morning, and made a decision. He applied to the police academy the following Monday. He graduated near the top of his class. His firearms scores were exceptional. But what his instructors kept noting in his evaluations was something harder to quantify. They wrote things like exceptional situational awareness and natural ability to de-escalate. One instructor wrote simply, "This one pays attention." And in a profession where not paying attention can get you or someone else killed, that was the highest compliment she knew how to give. Marcus spent his first 3 years on patrol before being selected for the K9 unit. The selection process is grueling, not just physically, but emotionally, because they're not just evaluating whether you can handle a dog. They're evaluating whether a dog will choose you, and Atlas chose Marcus almost immediately. On their first meeting, the young German shepherd walked straight past 4 other candidates and sat down at Marcus's feet and looked up at him like he'd been waiting. Their partnership over the next 7 years produced a record that still gets talked about in that department. 43 successful drug seizures, 11 missing persons located, 2 separate instances where Atlas tracked fleeing suspects for over 2 miles in the dark and held them until backup arrived. In one particularly extraordinary case, Atlas located a kidnapped 8-year-old girl in an abandoned warehouse after following a scent trail that was more than 18 hours old. The little girl was dehydrated and terrified, but she was alive. Her parents named their next dog Atlas, just so you understand the kind of mark this team left on people's lives. And then came the night of October 14th. It was a warehouse district call. Anonymous tip about a drug operation with suspected armed guards on site. The kind of call that requires backup, a plan, and patience. Marcus was part of the team that responded. What they found when they arrived was chaos. The operation had apparently started moving product early, and there were already 3 suspects fleeing on foot by the time the first units rolled up. Marcus deployed Atlas to pursue the primary suspect, heading toward the back of the property. What the security camera captured next was the foundation of the prosecution's case against him. In the grainy footage, you can see Marcus running, Atlas ahead of him on the lead. Then Atlas turns. That's the key moment the prosecutor played for the jury 47 times. Atlas turns, and instead of continuing forward, the dog appears to redirect toward Marcus. There's a struggle. The footage cuts out due to what investigators later said was an electrical failure in the camera system, though that detail never quite got the attention it deserved at trial. When the other officers arrived 30 seconds later, they found Marcus standing over the body of the fleeing suspect, who had been shot once. Marcus's weapon had been discharged, and Atlas was beside him, not aggressive now, just standing there in that alert, still way that working dogs stand when they're waiting for direction. Marcus told investigators that another man had been present, a third party he didn't recognize who had fired the shot and fled before his colleagues arrived. He said Atlas had redirected toward him not out of aggression, but because the dog had picked up on something, had sensed something wrong before Marcus consciously understood what was happening. He said Atlas had actually been trying to warn him. Nobody believed him. The forensic evidence was messy. The prosecutor was ambitious, and there was a political pressure behind this case that Marcus could feel but couldn't name. A sense that someone very much needed him to be guilty. His public defender was overworked and underprepared. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. And Marcus Webb, decorated officer, K-9 handler, the man who once ran toward gunfire so other people didn't have to, was sentenced to death. Atlas was retired from service shortly after. He was taken in by Marcus's former colleague, a woman named Officer Dana Chen, who had worked alongside Marcus and who never quite believed he was guilty, though she had no evidence to offer in his defense. She took the dog home, cared for him, and for 3 years watched Atlas do something heartbreaking every single evening around the time Marcus used to end his shift. He would go to the front door, sit down, and wait. Every night, like a clock. Like a dog who understood time better than anyone gave him credit for. When Dana got the call on that Tuesday morning from the warden's office, she sat very still for a long time. Then she put Atlas in the back of her car and drove to the prison without saying a single word to anyone. The visitation room where they brought Marcus wasn't meant for this kind of meeting. It was a gray concrete space with fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency that slowly drove everyone slightly out of their minds. There were 3 guards present. One of them was a broad-shouldered man named Garrett, a senior corrections officer who had been at the facility for nearly 2 decades. He stood near the back wall with his arms crossed. He hadn't wanted to allow this visit. He'd argued against it loudly to the warden that morning, but the warden had overruled him, and now Garrett stood in the corner with a look on his face like a man who was calculating something complicated and finding the numbers uncomfortable. Marcus was brought in wearing chains. The sound of them against the floor is the kind of sound you hear in dreams, low and rhythmic and final. He was thinner than the photographs from his trial. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but his back was straight. He moved with a quiet self-possession that made even the guards feel something they weren't comfortable feeling. Atlas came in on a leash held by Dana, and immediately, something went wrong. Or at least it looked that way. Atlas, who had been calm in the car, who had been calm walking through the facility, who had greeted Dana's own children every morning with a wagging tail and gentle eyes, came through that door and completely changed. His hackles rose along the full length of his spine. His ears went flat. A low, continuous growl began in his chest. He pulled hard on the leash, not toward Marcus, the way everyone expected, but in a direction that seemed almost random at first, toward the back left side of the room. Then he turned toward Marcus, and he started barking. Short, sharp, insistent barks of the type Dana had heard only when Atlas was alerting on a specific target. The guards laughed, Garrett especially. He said something that the other guards would remember later, something like, "See, even the dog knows." And the laughter echoed in that terrible concrete room with its buzzing lights, and Marcus stood in his chains with his eyes closed and said nothing. But Dana was watching Atlas with a very different kind of attention. Because Dana Chen had spent 3 years working with this dog, she knew his body language the way you know the expressions on a close friend's face. She knew the difference between fear, aggression, and alert behavior. She knew the difference between a dog that felt threatened and a dog that was doing his job. And what Atlas was doing in that room, with every fiber of his body and every ounce of his 7 years of training, was his job. He was alerting. But on what? Dana looked at Marcus. Atlas was directing his nose toward Marcus's left side, near the lower ribs, and the barking was intensifying in a very specific pattern she recognized. It was the pattern Atlas used when he'd found something, not someone dangerous, something hidden. She asked the guards to let her approach Marcus. Garrett objected. Dana pulled out her old department credentials and asked again with the kind of quiet authority that people with correct instincts always seem to have. The second request worked. She got close to Marcus. Atlas pressed his nose against the left side of Marcus's prison uniform, just below the ribcage, and then sat down. Hard and deliberate, the trained alert. Dana stood up slowly. She turned to Marcus and asked him if he had anything under his clothes on that side. Marcus looked confused. He said no, nothing, just his shirt. Dana asked the guards to allow Marcus to lift his shirt. Garrett made another objection, something about protocol, but the warden, who had been watching through a small window in the door, came inside and gave the authorization himself. Marcus lifted his shirt, and there, adhered to the inside of the fabric by what appeared to be a very small magnetic patch sewn into the original shirt he'd been wearing on the night of the arrest, was a piece of material. Not contraband, not a weapon, something that looked almost like nothing. A small strip of dark synthetic fabric with a barely visible chemical residue on it. The kind of residue that the right forensic lab could analyze and identify in ways that had never been done during the original investigation because nobody had ever thought to look for it. The room went very quiet, and then Atlas stopped focusing on Marcus entirely. He turned to the back of the room, and the growling returned, deeper now, more focused than before. Atlas fixed his gaze on Garrett with the absolute, unwavering certainty that only animals and the truth ever really possess. He wasn't barking now. He was still. He was locked in. And Garrett's face changed. If you've ever watched someone's composure fail, not gradually, but all at once, like a wall that holds and then simply ceases to exist. That's what happened to Garrett's face in the moment Atlas turned and looked at him. Because Atlas didn't just look at him the way a dog looks at a stranger. Atlas knew this man. The scent memory of a German Shepherd doesn't degrade the way human memory does. It doesn't soften at the edges or get confused by time. Atlas had encountered the scent of the man who had been in that warehouse 3 years ago. And that scent was standing 12 feet away in a corrections officer uniform. The warden was the first to understand what was happening. He was an older man who had spent 30 years watching people in moments of maximum pressure, and he knew the look of guilt the way a doctor knows a fever. He placed himself between Garrett and the exit. Garrett moved first. He made for the door on the opposite side, a service entrance that should have been locked but wasn't, because Garrett had made sure it wasn't, because Garrett had known this visit was happening, and had been in this room not out of professional obligation, but out of something far darker. He made it 3 steps. Atlas covered the distance between them in less time than it takes to describe. Dana had released the leash the moment she understood, and Atlas performed exactly the kind of controlled apprehension he had been trained for across 7 years, targeting the right forearm, grounding the man, holding him with a grip that 3 years of retirement had not weakened in the slightest. The sound Garrett made was the sound of a man whose carefully constructed world had just ended in a moment of absolute animal truth. 2 other guards had Garrett restrained within seconds. The warden was already on his radio, and Marcus Webb stood in the center of that gray room in his chains, with tears running silently down his face, watching his dog hold down the man who had taken everything from him, who had been present at that warehouse, who had fired the shot and walked away clean, while a good man's life was systematically dismantled. The investigation that followed over the next several weeks revealed what Atlas had apparently known in his bones for 3 years. Garrett had not been a random corrupt official. He had been deeply embedded in the drug operation that Marcus's team had raided that night. He had been the inside man, the one who had tipped off the operators, the one who had been at the warehouse not as law enforcement backup, but to protect the product. When the raid went sideways, he had fired the shot, pressed the weapon into Marcus's hand in those confused seconds before backup arrived, and then calmly walked away to grind the investigation from the inside, ensuring that the evidence stayed incomplete, that the forensic analysis stayed superficial, and that the one piece of physical evidence he hadn't been able to fully destroy, that small strip of fabric, got overlooked because nobody thought to look for it. The chemical residue on that fabric matched compounds found in Garrett's personal vehicle, combined with the original security footage, which a digital forensics team was now able to partially restore, and the testimony of 2 other officers who had always felt uncomfortable about the case, but had never had a framework for their discomfort. The case against Marcus Webb collapsed entirely, and the case against Garrett rose in its place. The exoneration came 6 weeks after that Tuesday morning. The paperwork, the hearings, the official declarations took time, as justice always seems to when it's moving in the right direction. But when the day arrived, when Marcus Webb walked out through the main gates of that facility in the thin golden light of an early morning in late autumn, he was not walking alone. Atlas was beside him, not on a leash, just beside him in the way that some partnerships don't need restraint or management because they operate on something deeper than that, on a loyalty that isn't trained so much as it simply exists, like gravity, like the fact that the sun rises in the east. Dana Chen stood outside the gates with her hand over her mouth. She'd cried more in those 6 weeks than in the decade before them. Several of Marcus's former colleagues were there, some journalists, a few strangers who had followed the case online and felt compelled to show up because some moments are so much about the basic human need to witness that you just get in your car and drive. Marcus stood in the morning light for a long time without speaking. He put his hand on Atlas's head. The dog leaned into him in that specific way that dogs lean when they're not asking for anything, just offering presence, just saying, "I'm here, I was always here, I never stopped." And if you're watching this and thinking about what the lesson of this story is, I want to be careful not to reduce it to something too neat or too simple, because Marcus Webb's story cost him years that he will never get back. And that's not a tidy moral, that's a tragedy. But inside the tragedy, there is something true and worth holding on to. The truth doesn't disappear just because nobody is looking for it. It doesn't dissolve just because the powerful would prefer it gone. Sometimes the truth waits. Sometimes it waits in the body of a German shepherd who goes to a door every evening at shift change time and sits there because every instinct he has tells him his partner is coming home. And sometimes that fidelity, that refusal to accept the lie that the world is trying to sell you, becomes the very thing that saves a life. Atlas didn't understand exoneration. He didn't understand wrongful conviction or forensic evidence or prosecutorial misconduct. He understood one thing, the thing that dogs have always understood with a clarity that humans keep losing and relearning. He knew who Marcus Webb was. He had always known. And on a cold Tuesday morning, with 6 hours left on a clock that had been counting all the wrong things, that knowing turned out to be enough. If this story moved you, if you believe that loyalty and truth deserve to be told loudly and often. Share this video with someone today. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, and the moments when that bond changes everything,